The dust kicked up from the auction ring at Miller's Livestock Exchange as Jake Thompson raised his weathered hand one final time. $50 for the lame donkey, he called out, his voice steady despite the snickers rippling through the crowd. The auctioneer's gavel fell with a sharp crack, sealing the deal that would make Jake the laughingstock of Clearwater County. What they didn't know was that Jake had spent 15 years as a geological surveyor before inheriting his father's failing farm. What they couldn't see was how the donkey, scarred and limping, kept pawing at a specific patch of ground near the loading pen, the same repetitive motion Jake had witnessed wild animals make near underground mineral deposits in Colorado. As Jake loaded the animal into his rusty trailer, his neighbor Earl hollered, "Hope you got money to burn, Thompson!" The crowd roared with laughter. But Jake's trained eye had already spotted something else, the unusual blue-green tint in the soil where the donkey had been digging. His heart raced as possibilities flooded his mind. Could this broken-down donkey be trying to tell him something that would save his farm from foreclosure? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The drive home stretched across 15 miles of winding country roads, and Jake found himself glancing in the rearview mirror every few minutes. The donkey stood remarkably still despite the trailer's gentle swaying, almost as if it understood this journey meant something important. Jake had named countless animals over the years, but something about this one demanded more consideration than Spot or Red. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across his property as Jake pulled into the driveway of the Thompson farm. 3 generations of his family had worked this land, and now it was slipping through his fingers like sand. The bank notice tucked into his glove compartment served as a constant reminder. 60 days to catch up on payments or lose everything. Jake backed the trailer up to the small paddock behind the barn, the same enclosure where his father had kept their old mule Chester decades ago. The donkey limped down the ramp with surprising dignity, favoring its right front leg but moving with purpose. Once inside the paddock, it immediately began that same pawing motion Jake had observed at the auction. But this time, Jake knelt down to examine the ground more closely. The soil here looked different too. Not the rich black earth that characterized most of his property, but something with that same blue-green undertone he'd noticed at Miller's. Jake scooped up a handful, rubbing it between his fingers. The texture felt familiar, a memory tugging at the edges of his consciousness from his surveying days in the Colorado mountains. His phone buzzed. Sarah, his daughter, calling from college. "Dad, I heard about the auction from Melissa Carter. Please tell me you didn't actually buy a donkey." Her voice carried that particular tone children use when they suspect their parents of questionable decisions. "His name is Prospector," Jake said, surprising himself with the spontaneous choice. "Prospector? Dad, are you okay? The farm's already struggling, and now you're spending money on $50, Sarah, and maybe the best investment I've ever made." A long pause. "What aren't you telling me?" Jake watched Prospector continue his methodical pawing, now creating a small depression in the earth. "I think this donkey might know something we don't. Dad, please don't go all mysterious on me. I worry about you out there alone." After hanging up, Jake spent the next hour setting up food and water for Prospector, all while keeping one eye on the animal's persistent digging behavior. As darkness fell, he finally headed inside, but sleep proved elusive. He kept thinking about the geological surveys he'd conducted years ago, the way certain animals seemed drawn to specific locations. Around midnight, Jake gave up on sleep and returned to the paddock with a flashlight. Prospector stood quietly in the corner, but the hole he'd been digging had grown noticeably deeper. Jake aimed the beam downward and felt his pulse quicken. Something glinted back at him from the bottom of the hole. Jake retrieved a small shovel from the barn and carefully expanded the depression. Within minutes, his light illuminated what appeared to be a metallic vein running through the subsoil, something that definitely didn't belong in ordinary farmland. He pulled out his old geological testing kit, stored in the barn since his surveying days. The preliminary tests would take time, but even in the darkness, Jake could see this wasn't ordinary soil composition. Prospector ambled over and nuzzled Jake's shoulder, the first truly friendly gesture the animal had made. "What exactly did you find, boy?" Jake whispered. The donkey's dark eyes seemed to hold secrets as ancient as the land itself. The jeers followed Marcus all the way to his rusted pickup truck, where the donkey stood tethered to the trailer hitch with remarkable patience. Children pointed and giggled while their parents shook their heads in bewilderment. Marcus had expected this reaction, but it still stung more than he cared to admit. "Well, girl," he murmured, untying the lead rope, "looks like it's just you and me against the world." The donkey's ears twitched forward at his voice, and for a moment Marcus could have sworn he saw something almost human in those dark, intelligent eyes. The drive back to his farm took 40 minutes through winding country roads. Marcus glanced frequently in his rearview mirror, watching the donkey maintain perfect balance in the truck bed despite the bumps and curves. Most animals would be nervous, but she seemed completely at ease, as if she'd done this journey 1,000 times before. His property came into view as they crested Millfield Hill, 200 acres of struggling farmland that had been in his family for 3 generations. The barn needed new shingles, the fencing required constant repair, and the old farmhouse sagged slightly to one side. But it was home. More importantly, it was all his, free and clear after 15 years of back-breaking work to pay off his grandfather's debts. Marcus backed the truck up to the pasture gate and climbed out. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the fields, and a cool breeze carried the scent of autumn leaves. As he lowered the tailgate, the donkey stepped down with surprising grace, immediately beginning to graze on the sparse grass near the fence line. "Smart girl," Marcus observed. "You know good grazing when you see it." Over the next hour, he set up a makeshift shelter using tarps and spare lumber. The donkey watched his every move with keen interest, occasionally wandering over to investigate his tools or nudge his shoulder with her soft muzzle. There was something almost conversational about her behavior, as if she were offering suggestions for the construction project. As darkness settled over the farm, Marcus brought out a bucket of water and a small portion of hay. The donkey approached cautiously but without fear, and as she drank, Marcus noticed something odd. Around her neck, barely visible beneath her shaggy coat, was a thin leather cord. His fingers found a small object hanging from it, a tarnished brass medallion roughly circular with strange markings etched into its surface. "What's this, girl?" he asked softly, lifting the medallion to examine it in the porch light. The symbols were unlike anything he'd seen before, not quite letters, not quite pictures, but something in between. They seemed to shimmer slightly in the yellow glow, though that might have been his imagination after the long, eventful day. The donkey pulled away gently as if protecting the medallion, and Marcus respected her wishes. Whatever the trinket meant, it was clearly important to her. He made a mental note to research the symbols later, perhaps at the library in town. Sleep came fitfully that night. Marcus found himself checking the window repeatedly, worried that his new companion might wander off, or that someone might try to steal her, though he couldn't imagine why anyone would want to. Each time he looked out, she was there, sometimes grazing, sometimes simply standing alert in the moonlight like a sentinel. Morning brought an unexpected discovery. Marcus stepped outside with his coffee to find the donkey standing at the far corner of the pasture, pawing at the ground with unusual persistence. The spot she'd chosen was near an old oak tree that his grandfather had always claimed was the oldest living thing on the property. "What is it, girl?" Marcus called out, walking over to investigate. The donkey had scraped away several inches of soil and dead leaves, revealing something that made Marcus's heart skip. The corner of what appeared to be a wooden box protruded from the earth, its surface darkened with age, but still intact. The donkey looked up at him expectantly, as if waiting for him to understand the significance of her find. Marcus knelt beside the exposed corner, his mind racing. His grandfather had always hinted at family secrets, stories that everyone dismissed as the ramblings of an old man, tales of hidden treasures and mysterious benefactors, of fortunes lost and found. Marcus had never given them much credence, but now he looked up at the donkey, who seemed to be watching him with an almost knowing expression. The medallion around her neck caught the morning light, and those strange symbols seemed to pulse with meaning just beyond his comprehension. "How did you know?" he whispered. The donkey simply flicked her ears and returned to pawing at the earth, as if to say the real work was just beginning. The morning sun cast long shadows across Samuel's weathered farm as he led the donkey toward the old barn. Every step the animal took seemed deliberate, almost calculated, which struck him as odd for a creature that had appeared so lifeless at the auction. The other farmers' laughter still echoed in his mind, but something about the way the donkey had looked at him, really looked at him, made him certain he'd made the right choice. "Well, girl, I suppose you'll need a name," Samuel murmured, running his hand along her dusty grey coat. The donkey turned her head toward him, and he could swear he saw intelligence flickering in those dark eyes. "How about Sage? You got that wise look about you." "Easy there," Samuel said, but Sage was insistent, her ears pricked forward with purpose. She led him past the chicken coop, past the vegetable garden his late wife had tended with such care, directly to the base of the massive oak. There, she stopped abruptly and began pawing at the ground with her front hoof. Samuel frowned. The earth here looked different somehow, softer, more recently disturbed than it should be after years of settling. Sage continued her deliberate pawing, creating a small depression in the soil. Dust motes danced in the filtered sunlight as she worked, her movements precise and determined. "What are you trying to show me?" Samuel knelt beside her, brushing away loose dirt with his hands. His fingers encountered something hard and smooth. A chill ran down his spine as he cleared more earth away, revealing the corner of what appeared to be a wooden box. The discovery sent his heart racing. In all his years on this farm, inherited from his grandfather, he'd never known anything was buried here. Samuel glanced around nervously, though his nearest neighbor lived half a mile away. Sage stood perfectly still now, watching him with those knowing eyes. With trembling hands, Samuel dug deeper. The box was larger than he'd initially thought, roughly the size of a cigar box, but heavier, much heavier. Intricate carvings decorated its surface, symbols he didn't recognize, intertwining patterns that seemed to shift in the dappled light. The wood itself was dark with age, but remarkably well preserved. He lifted the box carefully, surprised by its weight. A small brass latch held it closed, green with patina but still functional. Samuel hesitated, his thumb hovering over the mechanism. Something about this felt momentous, as if opening it would change everything that came after. Sage nudged his shoulder with her muzzle, a gentle encouragement that broke his paralysis. The latch clicked open with surprising ease. Inside, nestled in faded velvet, lay a collection of items that made no immediate sense together. There was a rolled parchment tied with a black ribbon, several tarnished silver coins unlike any currency Samuel had ever seen, a small brass key with an ornate head, and strangest of all, a photograph that couldn't have been more than a few years old, despite the box's obvious age. Samuel picked up the photograph with shaking fingers. It showed a group of people standing in what appeared to be the town square. But something was off about their clothing, their faces. They looked modern yet timeless, familiar yet completely unknown to him. In the background, he could make out the old courthouse clock tower that had been demolished when he was a boy. The parchment crackled as he unrolled it, revealing a hand-drawn map of his own property and the surrounding area, but this map showed things that didn't exist. Buildings where there were only fields, roads that had never been built, and, most unsettling of all, a marking exactly where they now stood beside the oak tree with the notation, "Where it all begins." At the bottom of the map, in an elegant script that seemed to shimmer in the light, were the words, "For the one who shows kindness to the forgotten." Samuel's hands shook as he looked from the map to Sage, who watched him with an expression that seemed almost human in its knowing quality. The donkey that everyone had laughed at, the animal that had seemed broken and worthless, had led him directly to this buried mystery on his first morning on the farm. Questions flooded his mind. Who had buried this box? How had Sage known where to find it? What did the cryptic message mean? And perhaps most importantly, what was he supposed to do now that he'd found it? Sage stepped closer and gently nuzzled the brass key in his palm, as if directing his attention to it specifically. Samuel held it up to the light, studying its unusual design. Somewhere, this key opened something important, and somehow, he knew that finding that lock would lead him deeper into a mystery that had been waiting patiently for him to discover it. The morning sun cast long shadows across Thomas's weathered fields as he led the donkey toward the old barn. He'd spent most of the night thinking about what to name her, settling finally on Pearl, not for any beauty she possessed, but for the way something precious could hide beneath the most unlikely exterior. Pearl moved with surprising grace despite her ungainly appearance, her ears swiveling at every sound. Thomas noticed how she avoided the main path, instead picking her way along the fence line where the grass grew thicker. Smart, he thought. She knows where the good grazing is. The barn stood at the far end of his property, its red paint faded to the color of dried blood. Thomas hadn't used it much since his father died. Too many memories lingered in its shadows. But it would provide shelter for Pearl, and the adjacent paddock would give her room to roam. As they approached the barn door, Pearl suddenly stopped. Her ears shot forward, and she released a sound Thomas had never heard from a donkey, a low, melodious call that seemed almost musical. The hair on his arms stood up. "What is it, girl?" He followed her gaze but saw nothing unusual. Just the barn, the oak tree his grandfather had planted, and beyond that, the rolling hills that marked the boundary of his land. Pearl tugged against the rope, not away from the barn, but toward the far corner where wild blackberry vines had grown thick against the weathered boards. Thomas frowned. There was nothing there but brambles and memories of his childhood adventures. "Come on now," he coaxed, but Pearl planted her feet and refused to budge. She called out again, that strange, haunting sound echoing across the empty fields. From somewhere in the distance came an answer. Thomas's blood chilled. The sound was faint but unmistakable, another donkey calling back, but that was impossible. He was the only one for miles around who kept livestock, and even then, just a handful of chickens and an old milk cow. Pearl's ears swiveled like radar dishes, tracking the sound. She pulled toward the blackberry thicket with renewed determination, nearly yanking the rope from Thomas's weathered hands. "Easy there," he muttered. But his own curiosity was stirring. He'd lived on this land for 37 years, had explored every inch of it as a boy. There were no other donkeys nearby, he was certain of that. Against his better judgment, Thomas allowed Pearl to lead him toward the brambles. The thorns caught at his work shirt as he pushed through the overgrowth, following the determined donkey deeper into the tangle. Pearl seemed to know exactly where she was going, picking a path through the thorns as if she'd walked it 1,000 times before. Behind the thicket, hidden from view, Thomas discovered something that made him stop dead in his tracks. A gap in the barn's foundation, partially concealed by decades of growth. The opening was just large enough for a person to crawl through, or for a donkey to squeeze into. Pearl nickered softly and touched her nose to the edge of the opening. The sound she made was different now, almost conversational, as if she were greeting an old friend. "I'll be damned," Thomas whispered. He knelt beside the gap, peering into the darkness beyond. The air that drifted out was cool and carried an odd smell, not musty like he'd expected, but clean somehow, with a metallic tang that reminded him of coins fresh from the mint. Pearl pushed past him and began working her way through the opening. For a moment, Thomas considered stopping her. The gap led under the barn, into spaces that had been sealed off for good reason. But something in the donkey's manner, the certainty of her movements, the purposefulness of her actions, convinced him to follow. The space beneath the barn was larger than it had any right to be. Thomas's eyes adjusted slowly to the dim light filtering through cracks in the floorboards above. What he saw made his breath catch in his throat. The area had been deliberately excavated, creating a chamber that stretched back toward the center of the barn. The walls were lined with stones, fitted together with the kind of careful craftsmanship his great-grandfather had been known for. And there, in the far corner, stood another donkey. But this one wasn't moving. It took Thomas several long moments to realize he was looking at a statue, carved from some kind of dark stone and polished to an almost mirror finish. The craftsmanship was extraordinary, capturing every detail from the alert ears to the intelligent eyes. Pearl walked straight to the statue and nuzzled its stone muzzle, just as she had with the gap in the foundation. Her actions seemed ritualistic, as if she were performing a ceremony she'd done many times before. Thomas stepped closer, his heart pounding with a mixture of fear and excitement. Whatever he'd stumbled into, it was far more than just a neglected donkey and a hidden room. The morning sun cast long shadows across Samuel's fields as he stood watching Dusty graze near the old oak tree. 3 days had passed since their discovery at the creek, and he'd barely slept. The metal box sat locked in his bedroom dresser, its contents burning in his mind like a fever he couldn't shake. Maps, hand-drawn, detailed maps of his property and the surrounding countryside, marked with symbols he didn't recognize, dates going back 30 years, and most puzzling of all, a letter addressed to someone named Margaret Hartwell, signed by his predecessor, Old Man Carver, who'd owned this land before Samuel bought it. Samuel had known Carver only briefly before the man died, a reclusive sort who'd lived alone and rarely spoke to neighbors. But according to the letter, Carver had been part of something much larger than anyone suspected. A rustling in the nearby brush caught his attention. Dusty's ears perked forward, and the donkey moved toward the sound with that same purposeful gait Samuel had learned to recognize. Whatever instincts drove this animal, they were sharp. "Easy, boy," Samuel murmured, following at a distance. Dusty stopped at a section of fence line that bordered the old Henley property. The land had been abandoned for years, ever since the bank foreclosed on it. Weeds grew tall between rusted fence posts, and the farmhouse in the distance sagged under neglect. But Dusty wasn't looking at the house. His attention was fixed on something at the base of the fence, a small cairn of stones that Samuel had never noticed before. As he approached, he could see the rocks weren't randomly placed. They formed a deliberate pattern, similar to some of the symbols he'd seen on Carver's maps. Samuel's pulse quickened. He pulled out his phone and compared the stone arrangement to a photograph he'd taken of one of the maps. The match was unmistakable. A voice behind him made him jump. "Didn't expect to see anyone out here this early." Samuel spun around to find a woman in her 60s standing 20 feet away. She wore hiking boots and carried a walking stick, her silver hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. Most striking were her eyes, sharp and intelligent, studying him with obvious curiosity. "I'm sorry," Samuel stammered, suddenly aware how suspicious he must look, photographing a pile of rocks on someone else's property line. My donkey wandered over here and I noticed." "The markers," she finished quietly. "You found them." The words hung between them like a challenge. Samuel's mind raced. This woman knew about the stone patterns. She might know about Carver, about the maps, about everything. "I'm Margaret Hartwell," she continued, and Samuel's breath caught. The name from the letter. "I've been waiting for someone to find those markers for 3 years now." "Waiting?" Margaret's gaze shifted to Dusty, who had moved closer and was watching her with calm interest. "Thomas Carver told me someday the right person would come along, someone who'd pay attention to the signs." She smiled slightly. "I'll admit, I expected it to be a person, not a donkey." Samuel's throat felt dry. "You knew Carver?" "We worked together for over 2 decades. A group of us, actually. Historians, archaeologists, treasure hunters, depending on who you asked." Margaret stepped closer to the stone marker. Thomas was convinced this area held something significant. Spanish colonial period, most likely. There were stories, passed down through local families, about a lost expedition that never made it back to Mexico. "Treasure stories," Samuel said skeptically. "More than stories." Margaret's expression grew serious. "We found evidence. partial records in old church documents, fragments of maps in private collections. Thomas spent his last years putting the pieces together on his property. "I assume you've found some of his work by now?" Samuel hesitated, then nodded slowly. "A box, maps and papers." "Good." Margaret looked relieved. "I was afraid they'd been lost when the bank cleared out his house. Thomas hid them well." "Why are you telling me this?" Samuel asked. "You don't even know me." Margaret smiled and gestured toward Dusty, who was now investigating another section of fence line 50 yards away. "Because that animal of yours has already done what took our team months to accomplish. In 3 days, he's led you to 2 of the most significant markers we identified." "2? The creek site and this one. If the pattern holds, there should be others." Margaret pulled a worn notebook from her jacket pocket. Thomas believed the markers form a trail, a path to something the Spanish expedition buried before they disappeared. Samuel watched Dusty moving methodically along the fence line, stopping occasionally to sniff the ground. The donkey's behavior suddenly made perfect sense, and no sense at all. "I have a proposition," Margaret continued. "Thomas left me his research notes. You have his maps and that remarkable donkey. Perhaps we could help each other finish what he started." Before Samuel could respond, Dusty's distinctive bray echoed across the field. The donkey was standing motionless near a cluster of wild blackberry bushes, his head raised in that alert posture Samuel had learned meant discovery. Margaret grinned. "Shall we see what he's found now?" The morning after discovering the cave, Thomas found himself pacing the kitchen before dawn, unable to shake the memory of those gleaming objects scattered across the cavern floor. He'd barely slept, his mind racing with questions about what they'd stumbled upon and what it might mean. When he finally ventured outside to begin his daily chores, he discovered Barnaby already waiting by the gate, ears perked forward with an alertness that seemed almost human. "You feel it too, don't you?" Thomas murmured, scratching behind the donkey's ears. "Something's changed." They made their way back to the hillside, Thomas carrying a proper lantern this time along with some basic tools he'd gathered from his shed. The entrance to the cave seemed smaller in daylight, partially concealed by the overhanging rocks and twisted roots that had probably hidden it for decades. As they descended into the cool darkness, the beam of Thomas's lantern revealed details he'd missed in his earlier excitement. The cavern was larger than he'd initially realized, extending back into shadows that his light couldn't penetrate. But it was the objects themselves that took his breath away upon closer inspection. What he'd taken for simple pottery in the dim glow of his phone's flashlight were actually intricately decorated vessels, their surfaces covered in patterns and symbols unlike anything he'd seen before. Some appeared to be made of bronze or copper, green with age but still bearing traces of their original luster. Thomas knelt beside a particularly ornate piece, a small figurine of what looked like a horse or perhaps a donkey, its surface etched with delicate spirals and geometric designs. As he lifted it carefully, he noticed something odd about its weight and the way it caught the light. This wasn't bronze at all, but something far more precious. His hands trembling slightly, he examined several more pieces, each more remarkable than the last. There were coins scattered among the larger objects, their faces worn smooth by time but still bearing the faint impressions of profiles and inscriptions in languages he couldn't read. A metal cup, tarnished but elegant, sat near what appeared to be pieces of jewelry, bracelets and rings that gleamed with an unmistakable golden hue even through their patina of age. Barnaby had positioned himself near the cave entrance, standing guard with a vigilance that Thomas had never seen in the old donkey before. Occasionally, the animal would turn to watch Thomas work, those intelligent dark eyes reflecting the lantern light with an almost knowing expression. "How did you know?" Thomas asked, glancing up from his examination of an ornate dagger with an intricate handle. "How did you know this was here?" The question hung in the air as Thomas continued his careful inventory. There were scrolls, too, wrapped in what might have once been leather or cloth, now brittle with age but miraculously preserved by the cave's dry environment. He didn't dare unwrap them here, but their very presence suggested this wasn't just a random collection of valuables, this was a deliberate cache, hidden away by someone who had chosen this remote location carefully. As the morning wore on, Thomas began to notice patterns in the arrangement of the objects. They weren't simply thrown together, but organized with purpose. The larger pieces formed a rough circle around the smaller, more delicate items, as if whoever had placed them here had been performing some kind of ritual or ceremony. The thought sent a chill down his spine, but also filled him with a deep sense of reverence for whatever ancient hands had last touched these treasures. The sound of voices in the distance made both Thomas and Barnaby freeze. The donkey's ears swiveled toward the cave entrance, and Thomas quickly extinguished his lantern, plunging them into darkness. Through the narrow opening, he could hear hikers passing by on one of the trails that crisscrossed the hillside. Their voices faded gradually, but the interruption served as a stark reminder of how exposed this discovery was, how easily someone else might stumble upon their secret. When silence returned, Thomas relit his lantern and began the careful process of documenting what they'd found. Using his phone, he photographed each piece from multiple angles, trying to capture the details of the engravings and markings. He had no idea what any of it meant, but some instinct told him that everything here was connected. The symbols, the arrangement, even Barnaby's inexplicable knowledge of the cave's location. As they finally prepared to leave, Thomas took one last look around the cavern. Tomorrow he would need to make some decisions about what to do with this discovery, who to contact and how to proceed. But for now, it was enough to know that it existed, that he and Barnaby had been chosen, somehow, to be its guardians. The old donkey led the way out of the cave, picking his path carefully up the rocky slope. As they emerged into the afternoon sunlight, Thomas felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders like a heavy cloak. The morning sun cast long shadows across the meadow as Thomas led Dusty toward the spot where they'd made their discovery. Word had spread through Millbrook despite his attempts at discretion, and a small crowd had gathered near his property line. Sheriff Morrison stood among them, his weathered face creased with concern as he examined the ancient stone markers Thomas had uncovered. "Been thinking about this all night," Morrison said, pulling a folded paper from his shirt pocket. "Went through the county records, and there's something you need to know." Thomas felt his stomach tighten. Beside him, Dusty snorted softly, as if sensing the tension in the air. The donkey had been restless since dawn, pawing at the ground and looking toward the woods with an intensity that made Thomas uneasy. "The Blackwood Mining Company filed exploration claims on this entire area back in 1923, Morrison continued. Claims that were never formally withdrawn. If what you've found here has any significant value, they might have legal grounds to contest ownership." A murmur rippled through the gathered crowd. Thomas recognized most of the faces. Neighbors who'd known his family for generations, shopkeepers from town, even old Pete Hawkins who'd sold him Dusty in the first place. Pete stepped forward, shaking his grizzled head. "That mining company's been defunct for 40 years, he said gruffly. "Surely that changes things." "Maybe," Morrison replied. "But corporate claims can be transferred, sold, inherited. I've sent word to the state capitol to research the current status, but it'll take time." Thomas ran his hand along Dusty's neck, drawing comfort from the animal's steady presence. The donkey had changed his life in ways he was still trying to understand. Yesterday's discovery of the underground chamber, filled with Native American artifacts and what appeared to be precious metals, had transformed his quiet existence into something he wasn't sure he was prepared for. "There's more," Morrison said, his voice dropping lower. "Got a call this morning from a man claiming to represent some investors. Seems word's leaked beyond our little town. He's driving down from the city today, wants to discuss development opportunities in the area." The crowd exchanged worried glances. Millbrook had remained largely unchanged for decades, its rolling hills and family farms a refuge from the sprawling development that had consumed so many neighboring communities. The thought of outside investors descending on their peaceful valley sent a chill through everyone present. Dusty suddenly lifted his head, ears pricked forward with alert attention. He pulled gently against his lead rope, moving toward the tree line where Thomas had first followed him days ago. Without fully understanding why, Thomas found himself trusting the donkey's instincts once again. "He wants to show us something else," Thomas said, surprised by his own certainty. The group followed as Dusty led them deeper into the woods than they'd ventured before. The donkey moved with purpose, navigating fallen logs and thick undergrowth as if following an invisible path. After 20 minutes of steady walking, they emerged into a natural clearing Thomas had never seen despite having lived on this land his entire life. In the center of the clearing stood a massive oak tree, its trunk easily 6 feet in diameter. But what captured everyone's attention were the symbols carved into its bark, the same intricate patterns they'd found on the artifacts in the underground chamber. The carvings were old, weathered by decades of seasons, but still clearly visible. "My God," whispered Sarah Chen, the town's librarian who joined them out of curiosity. "These markings, I've seen similar ones in historical texts about the Lenape people who lived in this region centuries ago. This could be a ceremonial site." Morrison nodded grimly. "Which complicates everything. If this is a Native American sacred site, federal preservation laws come into play. No one, not Thomas, not any mining company, not investors, can disturb it." Thomas studied the ancient tree, feeling the weight of history pressing down on him. What had started as a simple act of kindness toward an unwanted donkey had uncovered layers of the past he'd never imagined existed beneath his family's farm. Dusty approached the oak tree and stood perfectly still, as if paying his respects. There was something almost reverent in the donkey's posture that made Thomas wonder just how much the animal truly understood about what they'd discovered. "The question now," Morrison said, breaking the contemplative silence, "is what we do with all this knowledge. Those investors will be here by afternoon, and once word spreads beyond our county, this place will never be the same." As if summoned by his words, the distant sound of car engines drifted through the trees, multiple vehicles moving fast along the country roads toward Thomas's property. The outside world was coming to Millbrook, whether they were ready or not. Thomas placed his hand on Dusty's shoulder, grateful for the solid presence of his unlikely companion. Together they faced an uncertain future that would test everything they'd come to mean to each other. The morning mist clung to the hillside as Marcus led Dusty down the narrow path they'd discovered 3 days earlier. His leather satchel bounced against his hip, weighted down with the peculiar metal fragments they'd been finding scattered around the ancient stone structure. Sarah walked beside him, her notebook already filled with sketches and observations that would have impressed any archaeology professor. "Look at how he moves," she whispered, pointing at Dusty, who had stopped abruptly about 50 yards ahead. The donkey's ears swiveled like radar dishes, and his nostrils flared as he tested the air. "He's not just wandering anymore. There's purpose in every step." Marcus nodded, though he still couldn't shake the feeling that they were missing something crucial. The metal pieces they'd collected bore markings that looked almost like writing, but in no language either of them recognized. More troubling were the dreams that had started plaguing him since their first visit to the site. Vivid images of people in strange clothing moving through underground passages lit by an otherworldly blue glow. Dusty suddenly brayed and began pawing at a section of ground that looked identical to everything around it. But Marcus had learned to trust the donkey's instincts. He knelt and began brushing away loose soil and fallen leaves, his fingers soon encountering something hard and smooth. "Sarah, bring the brush," he called softly. Together they carefully exposed what appeared to be a circular stone plate about the size of a dinner table, inscribed with symbols that matched those on the metal fragments. "Marcus," Sarah breathed, her voice barely audible. "This isn't just old. This is ancient, pre-Roman, maybe older." She traced one of the symbols with her finger, and Marcus could have sworn he felt a slight vibration in the ground beneath his knees. A rustling in the nearby bushes made them both freeze. Marcus instinctively moved closer to Sarah as a figure emerged from the undergrowth, an elderly man with wild grey hair and clothes that looked like they hadn't seen a washing machine in months. "You shouldn't be here," the stranger said, his voice carrying an accent Marcus couldn't place. "Not yet. Not without understanding what you're awakening." Dusty, surprisingly, showed no alarm at the man's appearance. Instead, the donkey approached him with what could only be described as recognition, allowing the stranger to stroke his muzzle. "Who are you?" Sarah demanded, though her scholarly curiosity was clearly warring with caution. The man's weathered face creased into what might have been a smile. "My name is Elias. I've been waiting a very long time for someone to find this place again, though I must admit I expected scholars or treasure hunters, not a farmer and his remarkable companion." Marcus stood slowly, his hand unconsciously moving to the metal fragments in his satchel. Waiting for what, exactly? Elias gestured toward the stone disc they'd uncovered. "For someone to begin opening the seals, though I fear you have no idea what lies beneath your feet." He looked directly at Dusty, and Marcus could have sworn he saw something pass between them, some form of communication that transcended the normal relationship between human and animal. "The seals?" Sarah stepped forward, her notebook forgotten. "You mean there are more of these?" "7 in total," Elias confirmed, "placed here centuries ago by people who understood that some knowledge must be hidden until the world is ready to receive it, or until circumstances become desperate enough that the risks become acceptable." A chill ran down Marcus's spine that had nothing to do with the morning air. What kind of knowledge? Before Elias could answer, Dusty began moving again, heading toward a cluster of oak trees about 100 yards away. The 3 humans followed, Marcus noting how the donkey seemed to know exactly where he was going, despite never having been in this specific area before. At the base of the largest oak, Dusty stopped and began that same purposeful pouring. This time, Marcus needed no encouragement. Within minutes, they had exposed another stone disc, this one larger and bearing different symbols that seemed to shimmer in the dappled sunlight filtering through the leaves. 2 seals in 3 days, Elias murmured, and for the first time, Marcus heard genuine concern in his voice. "The process is accelerating." "What happens when all 7 are found?" Sarah asked, though something in her tone suggested she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. Elias was quiet for a long moment, his gaze alternating between the newly uncovered seal and Dusty, who had settled into an almost meditative stillness. "That depends entirely on who finds them first, and whether they have the wisdom to use what's revealed responsibly." The sound of vehicles approaching from the direction of the main road made them all turn. Through the trees, Marcus could see at least 3 dark SUVs making their way up the old logging road that led to this section of his property. "It seems," Elias said grimly, "that we're about to discover we're not the only ones interested in what lies buried here." The morning sun cast long shadows across the clearing as Thomas knelt beside the exposed stone slab, his weathered hands trembling slightly as he brushed away centuries of accumulated earth. Clementine stood nearby, her ears twitching with an alertness that had become familiar over the past weeks. The donkey's ability to sense things beyond normal perception no longer surprised him. It had led them here after all. The carved symbols beneath his fingers felt warm despite the cool morning air. They weren't like anything he'd seen in the local church or the few history books he'd managed to read. These markings seemed older, more primitive, yet somehow purposeful. Each line had been etched with deliberate care, forming patterns that suggested meaning beyond mere decoration. "What do you think, girl?" Thomas whispered, glancing at Clementine. "What exactly did you bring us to?" The donkey stepped closer, lowering her head to sniff at the stone. Her nostrils flared, and she made a soft sound, not quite a bray, more like a gentle hum of recognition. It was the same sound she'd made when they'd first discovered the hidden entrance to this place. Thomas had spent the better part of 3 days carefully excavating the area, working slowly to avoid damaging whatever lay beneath. What had started as a simple stone marker had revealed itself to be something far more significant. The slab was easily 6 feet square, and from what he could determine, it covered something substantial below. The farmer sat back on his heels, studying the symbols in the strengthening daylight. Some appeared to be astronomical, crude representations of stars and celestial movements. Others looked like maps or diagrams, showing pathways and connections that meant nothing to him. But there was one symbol that appeared repeatedly, carved deeper than the rest, a circle with radiating lines, like a sun, but with what looked like a key at its center. A rustling in the nearby bushes made both Thomas and Clementine turn. The donkey's ears stood at full attention, but her posture remained relaxed. Whoever approached wasn't a threat. Moments later, Samuel emerged from the tree line, carrying a canvas bag and wearing an expression of barely contained excitement. "I've been to the county records office," Samuel announced without preamble, his usual scholarly composure replaced by animated energy. "Thomas, what you found here, it's mentioned in documents dating back to the 1700s. Thomas rose, dusting off his knees. "What kind of documents?" Samuel opened his bag and withdrew several photocopied pages, their edges curled from hasty handling. Land grants, surveyor notes, even some correspondence between early settlers and the colonial government. They refer to this area as the marker grounds and mention something called the Keeper's Trust. The young man spread the papers on a flat boulder, pointing to passages he'd highlighted. "Look at this entry from 1743. The boundaries shall extend to the marker stones, beyond which lies the Keeper's Trust, as maintained by covenant with the original inhabitants." And here, he flipped to another page, a surveyor's note from 1756, strange symbols on stones, possibly of Indian origin, marking what locals claim to be a sacred trust. Thomas studied the documents, his pulse quickening. Sacred trust, Keeper's Trust. "What do you think it means?" "I'm not certain, but there are similar references throughout the records, always tied to this specific area, always mentioned with a sense of reverence or mystery." Samuel looked up from the papers. "Thomas, I think your property sits on something that's been protected or preserved for generations, maybe centuries." Clementine wandered closer to the stone slab, her hooves clicking against smaller stones scattered around its edges. She pawed at something partially buried, and Thomas went to investigate. Half hidden beneath a layer of moss and debris was another carved stone, smaller than the main slab but bearing similar symbols. As Thomas cleared it, he realized it wasn't just decorated, it was shaped. The stone had been deliberately carved into a specific form, with channels and indentations that suggested it might fit with other pieces. A puzzle of sorts, or perhaps a key. "Samuel," he called softly, "look at this." The younger man approached, his eyes widening as he took in the carved stone's intricate design. "It's beautiful," he breathed. "And look, those channels align with some of the symbols on the main slab." Thomas lifted the smaller stone carefully, surprised by its weight. As he held it up to catch the morning light, the carved channels seemed to glow faintly, as if the stone held some inner luminescence. "I think this is meant to fit somewhere specific." Clementine stepped closer to the main slab and pawed at its center, where the sun and key symbol was carved deepest. Her movements were deliberate, almost instructional, as if she understood something the two men hadn't yet grasped. Thomas knelt beside her, examining the central symbol more closely. The carved key at its center wasn't just decorative, it was an actual indentation, shaped to receive something specific. "Samuel," he said quietly, his voice thick with realization, "I think we're about to open something that's been sealed for a very long time." The morning sun cast long shadows across the meadow as Thomas sat on a weathered log, studying the strange symbols carved into the stone tablet they'd uncovered. Pepper grazed nearby, occasionally lifting her head to watch him with those knowing eyes that had started this whole adventure. 3 weeks had passed since their discovery in the cave, and the mystery only seemed to deepen with each passing day. "Any new insights?" Thomas asked, handing her the tablet as she settled beside him on the log. Sarah adjusted her glasses and traced the symbols with her finger. I've been comparing these markings with other pre-Columbian scripts, and I think we're looking at something unprecedented. The geometric patterns suggest a sophisticated understanding of mathematics and astronomy that predates anything we've found in this region. Pepper wandered over and nudged the tablet with her nose, causing both humans to laugh. The donkey had developed an uncanny ability to appear whenever they discussed the artifacts, as if she understood the importance of their work. "She's quite the archaeologist," Sarah observed, scratching Pepper behind the ears. "Have you given any more thought to the university's proposal?" Thomas's expression darkened. The state university had increased their pressure significantly, sending lawyers and bureaucrats who spoke of eminent domain and cultural patrimony. They wanted to excavate the entire property, turn it into a research site, and relocate Thomas somewhere else. The compensation they offered was generous, but money wasn't the issue. "This land has been in my family for 4 generations, Thomas said firmly. "My great-grandfather cleared these fields by hand. My father taught me to read the weather by watching those clouds over the ridge. I'm not selling, especially not to people who see me as an obstacle to their ambitions." Sarah nodded approvingly. "Good. Because I think there's something they don't understand about this site, something that goes beyond academic importance." She pulled out a leather journal and flipped to a page filled with sketches and notes. "I've been researching local folklore, and there are stories about this area that go back to the earliest European settlements. Tales of indigenous peoples who spoke of a guardian place somewhere in these hills, a location where ancient wisdom was hidden and protected." Thomas leaned closer to examine her drawings. "You think that's what we found?" "I think what we found is just the beginning." Sarah's voice carried an excitement that made Pepper's ears perk up. "Yesterday, I used ground-penetrating radar on the area around the cave. There are more chambers below, Thomas, much more extensive than what we've seen so far." The implications hung in the air between them. Thomas felt a familiar mixture of excitement and apprehension, the same feeling he'd experienced when Pepper first led him to that narrow opening in the cliff face. Every instinct told him they were standing on the edge of something momentous, but he also sensed the danger that knowledge could bring. "There's something else," Sarah continued, her voice dropping to almost a whisper. "I've been getting calls from other institutions. Word is spreading despite our efforts to keep things quiet. The Smithsonian, Harvard, even some private collectors. Everyone wants access to this site." Pepper suddenly lifted her head, ears swiveling toward the dirt road that led to Thomas's farmhouse. The sound of approaching vehicles carried across the morning air, too many engines for a casual visit. Thomas stood and shaded his eyes against the sun, watching a convoy of black SUVs wind their way up his driveway. "Expecting company?" Sarah asked, but the tension in her voice suggested she already knew the answer. "No," Thomas replied grimly. "But I have a feeling this is about to get complicated." The vehicles stopped in front of his house, and several figures in dark suits emerged. Even at this distance, their purposeful movement and coordinated action spoke of official business. Thomas recognized the type from his brief stint in the military years ago, government agents of some variety, probably federal. "We need to secure the artifacts," Sarah said urgently, already moving toward their equipment scattered around the excavation site. But Thomas remained still, watching the distant figures fan out around his property. Pepper stepped closer to his side, pressing her warm flank against his leg in a gesture that felt like solidarity. Whatever was coming, they would face it together, just as they had faced every challenge since that day at the livestock auction, when everyone laughed at the farmer who bought a broken-down donkey. "Let them come," Thomas said quietly, his hand resting on Pepper's neck. "This is our land, our discovery, and I'm not backing down." The morning sun cast long shadows across the meadow as Thomas led Ezra toward the coordinates Martha had discovered in her father's journal. The donkey's ears twitched forward with unusual alertness, as if sensing something beyond human perception. Behind them, Martha walked with measured steps, her grandfather's compass steady in her weathered hands. "According to the journal, we should find 3 oak trees forming a triangle somewhere near here," she called out, her voice carrying a mixture of excitement and apprehension. Thomas squinted against the early light, scanning the landscape that had become as familiar as his own reflection over the past weeks. The rolling hills stretched endlessly, dotted with clusters of trees that seemed to mock their search. Every formation looked promising from a distance, only to reveal itself as ordinary upon closer inspection. Ezra suddenly stopped, his hooves planted firmly in the soft earth. The donkey's head swiveled left, then right, his nostrils flaring as he tested the air. Thomas had learned to trust these moments of stillness. They always preceded something significant. "What is it, old friend?" Thomas murmured, running his hand along Ezra's neck. Without warning, the donkey veered sharply to the east, pulling Thomas along a barely visible path that wound through tall grass and scattered wildflowers. Martha hurried to keep pace, checking her compass repeatedly as they moved deeper into unfamiliar territory. The landscape began to change subtly. The grass grew thicker, more lush, and the air carried a different quality, cooler, somehow older. Ancient stone walls emerged from beneath decades of ivy and neglect, their purpose lost to time, but their presence undeniably deliberate. "Thomas," Martha whispered, her voice tight with recognition, "look ahead." 3 massive oak trees stood in perfect formation, their trunks so wide that it would take several people joining hands to encircle each one. The trees were ancient, their branches intertwining overhead to create a natural cathedral. Between them, the ground dipped slightly, forming a circular depression that seemed to pulse with hidden energy. Ezra walked directly to the center of the triangle and began pouring at the earth with increasing intensity. His actions were different this time, more focused, more urgent. Dirt and small stones flew as he worked, revealing patches of something that glinted dully in the filtered sunlight. Thomas knelt beside his companion, brushing away loose soil with trembling fingers. What emerged made his breath catch in his throat. Smooth stones, perfectly fitted together, formed what appeared to be the edge of a circular platform buried just beneath the surface. "It's a well," Martha said, kneeling beside him. "But not for water. Look at these markings." Along the visible edge of the stonework, intricate symbols had been carved with masterful precision. They were unlike anything Thomas had ever seen, not quite letters, not quite pictures, but something that seemed to bridge both worlds. The symbols appeared to shift and dance in the dappled light, filtering through the oak leaves. As they cleared more dirt away, the true scope of their discovery became apparent. The circular platform was at least 12 feet across, with the symbols running in concentric rings toward what appeared to be a sealed opening at the center. The stonework showed no signs of age or weathering, despite being buried for what must have been decades, possibly centuries. Ezra stepped back from his excavation, his task apparently complete. The donkey stood perfectly still, watching them with those knowing dark eyes that had guided them through every discovery leading to this moment. Martha pulled her father's journal from her bag, flipping through pages with increasing excitement. "Here," she said, pointing to a sketch that matched the symbols they'd uncovered. Father wrote about Keystone Circle, a gathering place where the old knowledge was preserved. Thomas traced one of the symbols with his fingertip, feeling a strange warmth emanate from the stone. Preserved how? Before Martha could answer, a low rumble came from beneath their feet. The ground trembled slightly, and several of the symbols began to glow with a soft, golden light that seemed to come from within the stone itself. The effect spread slowly around the circle, each symbol brightening in sequence until the entire platform hummed with barely contained energy. Ezra snorted softly, apparently unsurprised by this development. The donkey stepped forward and placed one hoof on a specific symbol, causing the glow to intensify dramatically. "He knows," Thomas whispered in amazement. "Somehow, he knows exactly what to do." The center of the platform began to shift, ancient mechanisms grinding to life after years of dormancy. Stone slabs moved with surprising smoothness, revealing a spiral staircase that descended into darkness below. Cool air rose from the depths, carrying scents of old parchment, dried herbs, and something indefinably precious. Martha gripped Thomas's arm, her eyes wide with wonder and fear. "We're about to discover what my family has been protecting for generations," she said. "Are you ready for that responsibility?" Thomas looked at Ezra, then at the mysterious passage that had opened before them. Whatever lay below would change everything they thought they knew about the world. The morning air carried an unusual tension as Marcus led Tobias down the familiar path to the hidden chamber. Word had spread through Millbrook overnight about the archaeological team's arrival, and Marcus could feel the weight of watching eyes from cottage windows. The simple life he'd known for 37 years was dissolving like morning mist. Tobias seemed to sense the change too, his ears swiveling constantly as they walked. The donkey had grown sleeker in recent weeks, his coat gleaming with health, but his eyes held an ancient wariness that Marcus was only beginning to understand. Dr. Sarah Chen waited at the excavation site with 3 assistants and enough equipment to supply a small expedition. Her efficient smile didn't quite mask the excitement burning in her dark eyes as she approached the concealed entrance. "Mr. Hartwell, this is remarkable work you've done here. The preliminary photographs suggest we're looking at a Romano-British settlement, possibly with Saxon modifications. The preservation is extraordinary." Marcus nodded, though her words felt like they described someone else's discovery. "Tobias found it. I just followed." The donkey snorted softly, as if acknowledging the credit, then picked his way carefully down the stone steps. He'd made this journey dozens of times now, but never with strangers following. His hooves echoed in the narrow passage, each step deliberate and sure. The lantern light revealed the chamber exactly as Marcus had left it, the wooden chest secured but visible, the ancient tools arranged on stone shelves, the mysterious symbols carved into the walls. Dr. Chen's sharp intake of breath was audible in the silence. "My God," she whispered, pulling out a powerful LED flashlight that banished the shadows. "Look at these inscriptions. This isn't just Romano-British. There are much older symbols here. Celtic, possibly pre-Roman." Her assistants immediately began setting up equipment while she moved to examine the chest. Marcus had unlocked it at her request, revealing the scrolls and artifacts within. She photographed everything before touching anything, her movements reverent and precise. "These documents," she said, carefully lifting one of the better-preserved scrolls, "they appear to be land grants. Royal seals. If I'm reading this correctly, this chamber served as a repository for legal documents spanning several centuries." Marcus watched her work, feeling both fascination and loss. Each photograph, each measurement, each carefully catalogued artifact took his discovery further from him and deeper into the realm of academia and government bureaucracy. Tobias had wandered to the far corner of the chamber, where he stood motionless before a section of wall Marcus had never paid much attention to. The donkey's stillness was so complete it drew Marcus's attention away from the archaeologists. "What is it, old friend?" Marcus approached quietly, following Tobias's fixed gaze. The wall looked identical to the others, rough-hewn stone blocks fitted together with ancient mortar, but Tobias pressed his muzzle against one particular stone, breathing heavily through his nostrils. Marcus ran his hands over the area, feeling for loose mortar or hidden seams. His fingers found what his eyes had missed, a barely perceptible outline around one block, as if it had been removed and replaced many times. "Dr. Chen," he called softly, "could you bring your light over here?" The archaeologist hurried over, her beam revealing what Marcus's touch had discovered. The stone was indeed different, newer mortar, slightly different color, fitted like a carefully crafted plug. "Another hiding place," she breathed. "Brilliant. They used the chamber as a repository, but this was for something special." Working together with archaeological tools, they carefully removed the stone. Behind it lay a small cavity containing a single object wrapped in oiled cloth that had somehow survived the centuries. Marcus's hands trembled as he unwrapped it under Dr. Chen's watchful eye. Inside was a golden torque, a neck ring of twisted metal that gleamed as if it had been crafted yesterday. Celtic workmanship of extraordinary beauty and obvious significance. "This changes everything," Dr. Chen said quietly. "This isn't just a document repository. This site has been sacred for over 1,000 years. The Celtic torque, the Roman modifications, the Saxon additions, it's been continuously important to every culture that's lived here." Marcus looked at Tobias, who gazed back with those knowing eyes. The donkey had led him not just to treasure, but to the heart of his land's ancient story. Every generation had found this place, added to it, protected it. The weight of responsibility settled on Marcus's shoulders like a familiar yoke. This wasn't his discovery to sell or profit from. It was his to protect, just as others had protected it before him. Above ground he could hear vehicles arriving. More archaeologists, reporters probably, maybe government officials. The quiet morning was ending, and with it, his simple farmer's life. But Tobias nudged his shoulder gently, and Marcus understood. Some partnerships transcended circumstances. Whatever came next, they would face it together, the unlikely team that had awakened something extraordinary from its patient sleep beneath English soil. The storm that had been building all day finally broke as Marcus and Rosie made their way down the treacherous mountain path. Rain lashed against them in sheets, turning the narrow trail into a slippery nightmare of mud and loose stones. Marcus pulled his jacket tighter, squinting through the downpour at the lights of Millbrook twinkling far below. "Almost there, girl," he called to Rosie, who seemed remarkably unbothered by the weather. If anything, the little donkey appeared more sure-footed than ever, picking her way carefully down the slope as if she'd travelled this route 1,000 times. The leather satchel pressed against Marcus's chest beneath his jacket felt heavier with each step, not from its physical weight, but from the burden of what it contained. The documents they discovered in the hidden chamber would change everything for Millbrook, but they also painted a target on his back. Ezra Blackwood's men had already proven they'd stop at nothing to claim the mountain for themselves. A sharp crack echoed through the storm, the sound of a branch breaking, or perhaps something more sinister. Marcus froze, listening intently, but the rain masked any other sounds. Rosie's ears swiveled forward, alert. She'd heard it too. "Easy," Marcus whispered, stroking her neck. They were still an hour from town, vulnerable on the exposed mountainside. He urged Rosie forward, picking up their pace despite the treacherous conditions. The path curved sharply ahead, following the contour of a rocky outcrop. As they rounded the bend, Marcus's heart sank. 3 figures stood blocking the trail, their faces hidden beneath rain hoods. Behind them, the familiar bulk of Blackwood's black sedan was parked impossibly on the narrow mountain road. "Mr. Chen," called the center figure, his voice carrying easily over the storm. Marcus recognized him immediately. Victor Kane, Blackwood's head of security. "Terrible weather for a hike, don't you think?" Marcus's hand instinctively moved to the satchel. "Just heading home. Don't want any trouble." Kane stepped forward, water streaming from his coat. "I'm afraid that's not entirely up to you anymore. My employer is very interested in your recent archaeological discoveries. We'd like to discuss a mutually beneficial arrangement." "There's nothing to discuss," Marcus replied, trying to keep his voice steady. "I haven't found anything worth your boss's time." A cold smile played across Kane's lips. "Please, Mr. Chen, we've been watching. We know about the chamber, the documents, everything. You can make this easy on yourself, or—" He gestured to his companions, who stepped closer. Rosie suddenly brayed loudly, a sound that echoed off the rocks and made the 3 men jump. In that moment of distraction, she bolted forward, not away from the men, but directly toward them. "Rosie, no!" Marcus shouted. But it was too late. The donkey charged between Kane's legs, sending him sprawling into the mud. The other 2 men dove aside as Rosie wheeled around, her hooves slipping on the wet stones, but somehow maintaining perfect balance. She positioned herself between Marcus and the scattered men, her ears pinned back aggressively. Kane struggled to his feet, his expensive coat now caked with mud and his composure shattered. "Grab them both," he snarled. But as his men moved forward, Rosie did something extraordinary. She backed up against a loose section of the rocky outcrop and began kicking with her powerful hind legs. The first few strikes seemed random, but then Marcus realized what she was doing. The ancient stones, already weakened by centuries of weather and the current downpour, began to shift. A rumbling sound built overhead, growing louder by the second. "Rock slide!" one of Kane's men shouted. Everyone scattered as tons of loose rock and debris came crashing down onto the narrow road. The avalanche lasted only seconds, but when the dust settled, Kane and his men were trapped on the upper side of the slide, their vehicle buried under a mountain of stone. Marcus stared at Rosie in amazement. Somehow, she'd known exactly where to strike to trigger the slide, and more importantly, she'd positioned them safely out of harm's way. "How did you—" he began, but Rosie was already moving, picking her way around the edge of the rockfall with practiced ease. She looked back at him expectantly, as if to say, "Are you coming or not?" From the other side of the debris, Kane's voice rose in frustration. "This isn't over, Chen. Blackwood has resources you can't imagine." But his threats were already fading into the storm as Marcus and Rosie continued down the mountain. The lights of Millbrook grew larger with each step, promising warmth, safety, and answers to the questions that multiplied with every passing hour. As they reached the outskirts of town, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that Rosie was far more than she appeared. Tonight had proven that beyond any doubt. The question was, what other secrets was his remarkable companion hiding? The morning air carried an unusual tension as Thomas led Bartholomew down the familiar path to the hidden cavern. Word had spread through the village overnight about their remarkable discovery, and despite Thomas's attempts at discretion, a small crowd had gathered at the farm's edge. Among them stood Mayor Aldrich, his polished shoes already dusty from the trek, and Dr. Helena Morrison, the regional archaeologist who had driven through the night from the university. "I still can't believe it," whispered Mrs. Chen to her husband as they followed the procession. "That old donkey, leading them right to treasure." Bartholomew's ears twitched at the attention, but he walked with newfound dignity, his head held high. Thomas patted the donkey's neck reassuringly. Neither of them had asked for this circus, but the secret was out now. Dr. Morrison quickened her pace to walk beside Thomas. "The photographs you sent are extraordinary," she said, her voice barely containing her excitement. "If these artifacts are authentic, and preliminary analysis suggests they are, we're looking at one of the most significant archaeological finds in the region's history." The entrance to the cavern appeared ahead, partially concealed by the wild rose bushes that had grown over it through the decades. Thomas pushed aside the thorny branches, revealing the narrow opening that Bartholomew had first discovered. "How did he know?" Mayor Aldrich asked, gesturing toward the donkey. "How does an animal sense something like this?" Thomas shrugged. "Same way he knew which fields needed attention, I suppose. Bartholomew sees things differently than we do." Dr. Morrison was already unpacking her equipment, setting up portable lights that would illuminate the chamber properly. As the LED panels flickered to life, casting brilliant white light into the cavern, a collective gasp arose from the gathered crowd. The underground chamber stretched further than anyone had imagined. Ancient symbols covered every surface of the stone walls, telling stories that had been hidden for centuries. Clay vessels, some still intact, lined natural shelves carved into the rock. Bronze tools and ornaments lay scattered across stone tables as if their owners had simply stepped away and planned to return. "Remarkable preservation," Dr. Morrison murmured, carefully photographing each artifact before touching anything. The chamber's natural seal must have protected everything from moisture and temperature fluctuations. Mayor Aldrich was already calculating tourist revenue, his expression shifting between awe and entrepreneurial excitement. "We'll need to secure the site immediately, install proper access routes, maybe a visitor center." "Slow down, Harold," interrupted Eleanor, who had arrived with a second wave of curious onlookers. This isn't a theme park. It's history. Thomas found himself caught between wonder and worry as he watched the experts examine his discovery. Part of him felt proud that his instinct to trust Bartholomew had led to something so significant, but another part longed for the quiet simplicity of yesterday, when the most pressing concern had been whether the tomatoes needed watering. Dr. Morrison called him over to examine a particular section of wall art. "Thomas, look at this sequence here. These symbols appear to document farming techniques, crop rotation patterns that are remarkably sophisticated for their time period." The painted figures showed farmers working the land with methods Thomas recognized, techniques passed down through generations in the valley. The connection between past and present sent a chill down his spine. "They were like us," he said quietly, "working the same soil, facing the same challenges." Exactly. And this chamber might have been their record-keeping center, their library of agricultural knowledge. Dr. Morrison's eyes sparkled with scholarly excitement. "Your donkey didn't just find treasure, Thomas. He found our agricultural heritage." Bartholomew had wandered deeper into the chamber, his hooves clicking softly against the stone floor. Thomas followed, watching as the donkey stopped before a section of wall that hadn't yet been illuminated. Dr. Morrison adjusted one of the lights, and new images emerged from the shadows. These paintings were different, more recent, judging by their style and pigmentation. They showed a farming community under stress, crops failing, people leaving. But the final image in the sequence depicted a figure leading a donkey, both silhouetted against a rising sun. "It's a message," Thomas realized. "They left instructions, hope for whoever came after." Dr. Morrison nodded slowly. This chamber wasn't just abandoned, it was sealed intentionally, preserved for future generations who might need this knowledge. As the implications settled over the group, Thomas felt the weight of responsibility shift. This wasn't his discovery anymore. It belonged to everyone, to the community, to history itself. But somehow, knowing that Bartholomew had been the key to unlocking this ancient wisdom made everything feel right. The donkey lifted his head and looked directly at Thomas, as if sensing his thoughts. In those dark, intelligent eyes, Thomas saw not just an animal, but a partner who had bridged past and present, connecting him to generations of farmers who had worked this same land with hope, determination, and an unshakable bond with the earth that sustained them all. The ancient chamber stretched before them like a cathedral of forgotten time, its vaulted ceiling disappearing into shadows that their flashlights couldn't penetrate. Marcus held his breath as he swept the beam across walls covered in intricate carvings that seemed to dance in the shifting light. Beside him, Ezra stood perfectly still, ears pricked forward as if listening to whispers from centuries past. Dr. Sarah Chen moved with reverent steps along the perimeter, her archaeological training evident in every careful movement. "Marcus, this is extraordinary. These symbols, they're not just decorative, they're telling a story." Her voice echoed softly in the vast space, adding to the sense of sacred discovery. The farmer followed the beam of his flashlight across the nearest wall, where carved figures seemed to emerge from the stone itself. Scenes of daily life unfolded in remarkable detail, farmers tending crops, merchants trading goods, families gathered around tables laden with food. But it was the recurring image that captured his attention. Donkeys, everywhere donkeys, carved with the same loving attention given to human figures. "Look at this," Sarah called from the far wall, her excitement barely contained. "These aren't random decorations. This entire chamber is a historical record, a library carved in stone." She traced her finger along a series of symbols, her headlamp illuminating what appeared to be ancient text. "If I'm reading this correctly, this speaks of a great trust, something hidden during a time of war." Marcus felt Ezra shift beside him, the donkey's breathing steady and calm despite the underground environment. The animal had led them here with such certainty, as if following a map written in instincts older than memory. "What kind of trust?" Marcus asked, moving closer to examine the carvings Sarah was studying. "It's difficult to translate without proper reference materials, but—" Sarah paused, squinting at the symbols. It mentions protectors, guardian families who were entrusted with keeping something safe. And here, she pointed to a section where the carvings showed people leading pack animals into what looked like cave entrances. They hid whatever it was during a great conflict, but the knowledge of its location was preserved through generations. The implications sent a chill down Marcus's spine. He thought of his grandfather's stories, dismissed for years as the rambling tales of an old man. Stories of responsibility, of secrets kept, of trust passed down through generations. Sarah, what if the families who knew about this place, what if they passed the knowledge down not through maps or written records, but through their animals? Sarah turned to stare at him, her eyes wide in the harsh LED light. You mean genetic memory? Behavioral inheritance? She looked at Ezra, who was now exploring a section of the chamber with focused interest. It's not impossible. We know animals can inherit migration routes, return to breeding grounds they've never seen before. But this would be unprecedented, Marcus finished. He watched as Ezra moved with purpose toward the chamber's far end, where the shadows seemed deepest. But look at him. He's not exploring randomly. He knows exactly where he's going. They followed the donkey deeper into the chamber, their footsteps echoing off the stone floor. The air grew cooler as they moved away from the entrance, and Marcus noticed that the carvings here were different, more elaborate, more detailed. These walls told of ceremonies, of solemn gatherings where objects were blessed and hidden away. Ezra stopped before what appeared to be a solid wall, but as they drew closer, Marcus could see it was different from the others. The stone here was smoother, and the carvings formed a perfect rectangular frame around a section that seemed somehow separate from the rest of the wall. "It's a seal," Sarah whispered, running her hands along the edges. "Look at these markings. This was designed to be opened, but only by someone who knew how." She examined the carved symbols more closely, her academic excitement warring with professional caution. "Marcus, we should document everything before we proceed. Contact the proper authorities. Ensure this is handled correctly." But even as she spoke, Marcus noticed something that made his heart race. Among the symbols surrounding the sealed section, one stood out, a simple carving of a donkey's head, nearly identical to the distinctive white marking on Ezra's forehead. The same marking that had caught his attention at the livestock auction, that had seemed so familiar despite his certainty he'd never seen this particular animal before. Ezra pressed his nose against the wall near the carving, and Marcus heard a sound that made him freeze, a soft click, mechanical and deliberate. The donkey stepped back as if satisfied, and slowly, with a grinding of ancient mechanisms that had waited centuries for activation, the sealed section began to move. Sarah grabbed Marcus's arm, her grip tight with a mixture of excitement and terror. "Whatever's behind there," she whispered, "it's been waiting for you. For both of you." The wall continued its slow retreat into hidden recesses, revealing darkness beyond that seemed to hold the weight of history itself. The morning sun cast long shadows across the ancient stone platform as Marcus knelt beside the carved symbols, his weathered hands tracing the intricate patterns that had remained hidden for centuries. Clementine stood nearby, her ears twitching at every sound that echoed through the cavern entrance behind them. The donkey's instincts had proven invaluable once again. She had led them to this sacred place where the final piece of the puzzle awaited. "The alignment is perfect," whispered Dr. Sarah Chen, the archaeologist who had joined their expedition after word of their discoveries reached the university. "These symbols correspond exactly to the astronomical calculations we found in the monastery ruins." Marcus nodded, though his attention was divided between the ancient markings and the growing sounds of activity from the valley below. Word had spread quickly about their findings, and despite their efforts to maintain secrecy, treasure hunters and opportunists had begun converging on the area. The peaceful quest that had begun with a simple auction had transformed into something far more complex and dangerous. There, Sarah pointed to a series of interconnected circles carved into the stone. "This represents the celestial event that occurs only once every 144 years. According to the calculations, the next alignment happens tomorrow at sunset. Clementine moved closer to Marcus, nudging his shoulder with her muzzle. In the weeks since their partnership began, he had learned to interpret her subtle communications. This particular gesture meant danger approaching, something she had sensed long before human ears could detect it. "We have company," Marcus said quietly, rising to his feet and scanning the tree line that bordered the clearing. The first figure emerged from the shadows between the ancient oaks, Vincent Reeves, the wealthy collector who had been tracking their movements since the discovery of the first artifact. Behind him came three others, their expensive outdoor gear and determined expressions marking them as serious competition for whatever treasures lay hidden here. "Mr. Hartwell?" Reeves called out, his voice carrying the smooth confidence of a man accustomed to getting what he wanted. "I must say, you and your remarkable donkey have led us on quite an adventure." Sarah stepped protectively closer to the carved platform, her academic instincts warring with the very real threat these men represented. "This is an archaeological site of immense historical significance," she said firmly. "It belongs in a museum, not in some private collection." Reeves laughed, the sound harsh against the natural serenity of the clearing. "History is written by those who can afford to preserve it, Doctor. I'm prepared to offer Mr. Hartwell a sum that would make him the wealthiest farmer in 3 counties. Marcus felt the weight of decision settling on his shoulders like a familiar yoke. The money would solve every problem his farm had ever faced: new equipment, expanded land, security for his future. But as he looked at Clementine, remembering the journey that had brought them here, he knew that some discoveries transcended monetary value. "The answer is no," he said simply. The transformation in Reeves' demeanor was immediate and chilling. "I had hoped we could resolve this amicably. Unfortunately, you've chosen a more difficult path." The 3 men with Reeves began spreading out, their intentions clear. Marcus had worked hard all his life, building strength in his arms and endurance in his legs. But he was still 1 man against 4. Sarah clutched her research materials to her chest, her face pale but determined. Then Clementine stepped forward. The donkey's usual calm demeanor shifted to something Marcus had never seen before, a fierce protectiveness that seemed to awaken some ancient instinct buried deep in her bloodline. Her ears pinned back, her eyes focused with laser intensity on the approaching threat. The first man reached for Marcus's arm, intending to force him away from the platform. Clementine's response was swift and decisive, a perfectly timed kick that sent him sprawling backward into his companions. The donkey then positioned herself between Marcus and Reeves, her stance radiating a warning that even urban predators could understand. "Call off your associates," Marcus said, his voice carrying a new authority born of the extraordinary circumstances he had navigated. "This place has protected its secrets for centuries. It can wait a little longer for the right people to unlock them properly." Sarah seized the moment to activate the emergency beacon she carried, sending out a signal that would bring park rangers and university security to their location. The sound of the device seemed unnaturally loud in the tense silence. Reeves' expression cycled through frustration, calculation, and finally a grudging respect. "This isn't over, Hartwell. Men like you don't understand the forces you're dealing with." But as the sound of approaching vehicles echoed from the valley, it became clear that the immediate confrontation was indeed over. The wealthy collector and his companions melted back into the forest as efficiently as they had appeared. Marcus placed his hand on Clementine's neck, feeling her gradually relax as the danger passed. Tomorrow would bring the celestial alignment and perhaps the final revelation of their quest. Tonight, however, belonged to the quiet satisfaction of standing their ground when it mattered most. The morning sun cast long shadows across the meadow. As Thomas stood at the edge of the hidden chamber, his weathered hands trembling slightly as he held the ancient scroll, the donkey, whom he'd come to call Solomon, stood beside him with an almost regal bearing that seemed impossible for the scraggly creature he'd bought at auction just weeks ago. "I can't read this," Thomas admitted to his unlikely companion, his voice barely above a whisper. The symbols etched into the parchment were unlike anything he'd seen in his simple farmer's life. But Solomon's ears twitched, and the donkey turned toward the village with such deliberate intention that Thomas understood immediately. The walk back to town felt different this time. Word had already spread about Thomas and his treasure-hunting donkey, and people lined the streets to catch a glimpse of them. Some pointed and whispered, others laughed outright, but Thomas noticed something new in their expressions, a flicker of curiosity that hadn't been there before. At the library, Mrs. Helena Morrison looked up from her desk with surprise. The elderly librarian had known Thomas since he was a boy, but she'd never seen him cross her threshold with such purpose. "Thomas Fletcher," she said, adjusting her glasses. "What brings you here?" Without a word, Thomas carefully unrolled the scroll on her desk. Mrs. Morrison's sharp intake of breath told him everything he needed to know. "Where did you find this?" she whispered, her fingers hovering over the ancient parchment without quite touching it. "Solomon led me to it." Thomas glanced toward the window where the donkey waited patiently, as if he understood the importance of what was happening inside. Mrs. Morrison's eyes widened. "This is Aramaic, very old Aramaic." She reached for a magnifying glass and bent closer. "Thomas, this appears to be, it's a deed, a land grant from the original settlement of this area." The words hung in the air like dust motes in sunlight. Thomas felt his knees weaken. "What does that mean?" "It means," Mrs. Morrison said slowly, still studying the document, "that someone in the distant past was granted a very large tract of land. Land that, according to these coordinates—" She paused to consult an old map from her files. "Thomas, this includes your farm and most of the surrounding area." The implications hit him like a physical blow. "But how is that possible? My family's owned that land for generations." "Owned it, yes, but never with a clear title going back to the original land grants. Most of the early records were lost in the courthouse fire of 1887. Mrs. Morrison's voice grew more excited as she continued reading. "Thomas, if this document is authentic, and it certainly appears to be, you may own far more land than you ever realized. Legally own it." Thomas thought about the developers who'd been circling his property like vultures, making increasingly aggressive offers. He thought about the pressure from the bank, the mounting debts, the sleepless nights wondering how long he could hold on to his family's farm. "How much land are we talking about?" Mrs. Morrison traced the boundaries with her finger. "Roughly, oh my, roughly 800 acres, including the Morrison Creek frontage, the old quarry site, and—" She stopped, her face pale. "Thomas, this includes the land where they want to build the new shopping complex. The shopping complex that would make whoever owned the land incredibly wealthy." Outside, Solomon snorted softly, as if he'd been listening to every word. Thomas walked to the window and looked into the donkey's intelligent brown eyes. There was something almost human in that gaze, something that suggested Solomon had known exactly what they would find. "Mrs. Morrison, what do I need to do to make this official?" "You'll need a lawyer, a good one who specializes in property law. And you'll need to file this with the county clerk's office immediately." She carefully rolled the scroll back up. "Thomas, you understand what this means, don't you? You're not just a farmer anymore. You're a landowner, a wealthy landowner." Thomas nodded slowly, but his thoughts weren't on wealth or shopping complexes. They were on Solomon, the laughing-stock donkey who'd somehow led him to salvation. He thought about the moment at the auction when everyone had mocked his winning bid, how foolish he'd felt walking home with his $20 purchase. As he stepped outside, Solomon approached and nuzzled his shoulder gently. Thomas stroked the donkey's coarse mane and whispered, "How did you know, old friend? How did you know exactly where to look?" Solomon's only response was to turn his head toward home, toward the farm that was now revealed to be something far greater than either of them had imagined. But as they began walking, Thomas could have sworn he saw something like satisfaction in the donkey's ancient knowing eyes. The morning sun cast long shadows across the pasture as Thomas stood beside Gideon, watching the archaeological team carefully extract the final artifacts from the ancient chamber. 3 months had passed since their discovery, and the world had indeed changed, though not in the ways he'd initially imagined. Dr. Sarah Chen emerged from the excavation site, her face bright with excitement despite the early hour. "Thomas, you need to see this," she called, holding a delicate bronze tablet covered in intricate symbols. "We've finally translated the full inscription. It's not just a treasure vault, it's a library, a repository of agricultural knowledge from a civilization we never knew existed." Thomas approached, Gideon following close behind. The old donkey had become something of a mascot for the research team, and his presence seemed to calm everyone's nerves during the more intense discoveries. What kind of knowledge? Crop rotation techniques, irrigation systems, soil preservation methods, all far more advanced than anything we thought possible for this time period. Sarah's voice trembled with wonder. Some of these techniques could revolutionize modern farming, especially in areas struggling with climate change and soil depletion. As if sensing the importance of the moment, Gideon stepped forward and gently nuzzled the tablet. Sarah laughed. "I think he approves." The sound of approaching vehicles broke the morning stillness. Thomas turned to see a convoy of black SUVs winding up the dirt road toward his farm. His stomach tightened. He'd been expecting this visit, though dreading it all the same. Margaret Rothwell emerged from the lead vehicle, her expensive suit looking oddly out of place against the rural backdrop. Behind her came a small army of lawyers and what Thomas assumed were government officials. Her face wore the same cold expression it had carried during their last encounter, when she'd threatened legal action to claim the discovery. "Mr. Hayes," she said, approaching with calculated confidence, "I trust you've reconsidered my offer. The proper authorities should oversee a discovery of this magnitude." Thomas stood his ground, one hand resting on Gideon's neck. "The proper authorities are already involved, Mrs. Rothwell. The university team, the Historical Preservation Society, the Agricultural Department, they're all working together. Under your direction," she replied sharply. "A simple farmer has no business controlling access to such significant historical artifacts." Dr. Chen stepped forward, the bronze tablet still in her hands. "With respect, Mrs. Rothwell, Mr. Hayes has shown remarkable wisdom in managing this discovery. He's ensured that the knowledge will be shared freely with the global scientific community rather than locked away in some private collection." Margaret's eyes fixed on the tablet, and Thomas saw the familiar hunger there, the same look she'd worn when describing her plans to monetize the discovery. "These artifacts belong in a proper museum, under professional care. They'll be displayed in the new research center," Thomas said quietly. "Right here on the farm, where they were found. People from around the world will come to study them, learn from them. The knowledge will be used to help farmers everywhere, not just admired behind glass." Gideon suddenly brayed loudly, startling everyone. The donkey stepped between Thomas and Margaret, his ears pinned back in an unmistakable warning. Even the lawyers took a step backward. Margaret's composure finally cracked. "This is ridiculous. I won't be intimidated by a donkey." "Maybe you should be," said a new voice. Sheriff Coleman approached from behind the vehicles, his expression stern. "Especially considering that donkey led to the greatest archaeological discovery in the state's history while you're here trying to steal credit for it." "I'm not stealing anything," Margaret protested. "I'm simply ensuring proper stewardship." "You're trespassing," Coleman interrupted, "and harassing a man who's done nothing but share his good fortune with the world. I suggest you and your entourage leave before I decide to press charges." For a moment, Thomas thought Margaret might continue her fight. Then her shoulders sagged slightly, and he saw something unexpected in her eyes, not defeat, but perhaps a glimmer of understanding. "You could have been rich," she said to Thomas, her voice softer now. "Truly wealthy beyond imagination." Thomas looked around at the bustling excavation site, the excited researchers, the carefully planned construction of the new center that would preserve and share the ancient knowledge. He thought of the farmers around the world who would benefit from these discoveries, the students who would come to learn, the future generations who would inherit this wisdom. "I am rich," he replied simply. As the convoy departed, Dr. Chen placed a hand on Thomas's shoulder. The university board approved the funding for the permanent research facility yesterday. Construction begins next month. Thomas nodded, watching the dust settle behind the retreating vehicles. Gideon nudged him gently, and he scratched behind the donkey's ears. "Think we made the right choice, old friend." Gideon's answering bray echoed across the pasture, and Thomas smiled. Sometimes the greatest treasures weren't meant to be owned, they were meant to be shared.